This Gumbands podcast is made possible by the Buell Foundation, serving southwestern Pennsylvania since 1927, and by listeners like you. Thank you.
Okay, this is Gumbands, episode whatever it is, with Rick and Rich.
7?
Take 1.
8? I'm not sure. Who's doing the intro, you or me?
I'll do the intro. Welcome to Gumbands. My name is Rich Capaldi, and I work with Rick Sebak producing these shows. Usually you'd hear Rick right now, but today we're doing something a little different. QED producer Rick Sebak is the guest on this episode. If you've lived in Western Pennsylvania in the past few decades, you may know who Rick is. Even if you don't know who he is, you may know some of his shows.
Pittsburgh A to Z, a hot dog program right beside the river. Downtown Pittsburgh, South Side, North Side Story, the Pennsylvania Road Show. What makes Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh? The Mon, the Al, and the O.
Rick has been making lots of shows throughout the years, some of which have helped us to learn all about this region we call home. For this episode, I thought it could be fun to learn a little bit more about Rick. This is Gumbands, episode 008, Rick Sebak. And we thought that this could be fun today, to talk to you.
Well, you suggested it. I would think it's maybe a little premature in the history of Gumbands, but I know that you're aware that I have this weird anniversary coming up.
It's a milestone,
Well,
a career milestone, which is 50 years with public broadcasting.
Right. It'll be 50 years since I first worked for a public television station, which was in South Carolina. I was still a student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, but I got a summer internship at South Carolina Educational Television, working with a Pittsburgh legend, Josie Carey, who helped start WQED. She was Fred Rogers' producing partner on the first show down here at WQED, which was called Children's Corner. And I wrote her a letter. I mean, I sat at a typewriter.
That's how you got the internship?
That's how, well, I sent her a letter, and I said I remembered her from Pittsburgh, and I had a fellowship that would partially pay for my summer, and would she consider having a summer intern on her children's show that she was making in South Carolina, which I had heard about, called WHEE, WHEEE exclamation point. And she responded to my letter, and she said, hey, we'd like to meet you. Why don't you come down on your spring break? So I did that. I went to Columbia, South Carolina for the first time. I stayed in a sleazy little motel on Two Notch Road, and I went, and they seemed to like me, and they said, yeah, let's do this. We'll take you on as a summer intern. Come back in early June, and we'll start then. So I had to finish up school, probably in early May at Chapel Hill. I drove back to Pittsburgh, got everything together, decided what I needed to take to South Carolina, and I drove back to South Carolina, found a place to live, and I went to work that first day at South Carolina ETV, which was June 5th, 1973, and it was my birthday. And I went in, and Josie said, hey, welcome. You're so happy you're here. How are you feeling today? And I said, great, it's my birthday. And Josie said, no, you don't start a new job and say it's your birthday, like hoping that we're going to be nice to you. And we all laughed about it and everything. But that's why I remember that I started that job, never knowing that how few jobs I would have in my life. Since college, I've only had 2 jobs, both in public television, one in South Carolina for 11 years, and now here at South Carolina ETV, here at WQED for 36 years. So, we're coming up to 50 years of solid, but this year is just the 50th anniversary of me first working for PBS. The next summer I was a student in France. I took a year off and went to France and did my junior year abroad and sort of stayed through that next summer. So I didn't. But then Josie had me back, and I used to work while I was still a student. I would drive from Columbia, South Carolina, from Chapel Hill down to Columbia to work with her. And it's odd, I remember I would drive late on Friday, often at night. And I remember one time a cop pulled me over. And he said, your tail light is out. He said, I just wanted somebody to talk to. And I just thought, I remember that the cop just wanted somebody to talk to. It was the middle of the night, and I guess he was falling asleep or something. So it worked out okay.
So if we go back, so you were actively trying to work in television, did you know that? When did you know you wanted to work in TV, or did you know you wanted to work in TV?
No, not till I was in college. And at Chapel Hill, they had a department, which is now called the College of Communications. But at that time, it was called RTVMP, Radio, Television, Motion Pictures. I actually started, I think, assuming that I would be a double major in English. I always knew that I would be an English major. English and theater. I'd done a lot of theater in high school and stuff, and my mom helped found Stage 62 in Bethel Park, and we always had community theater in our lives. And as a theater student, on weekends we had to go be talent for a TV workshop in Raleigh. It was through the RTVMP department. They were allowed to take over the studio of a commercial station in Raleigh. And we had to go just be people that they needed, people to be guests or people to be hosts or people to be in a drama or anything. And I went and did that pretty regularly, and I just thought the guy who was teaching that course was so good. And I said, I want to take his course. And they said, well, you have to be a major in RTVMP to take his course. And I said, okay, I'll change my major. Why, And I did. And I dropped the theater and I went to TV, and I don't think I ever looked back. His name was Paul Nichols. He had been a director of television during sort of what they used to call the golden age of television, like live dramas and stuff. And that's the way he taught it, was, you're going to do this live. And you had to do whatever project you were doing, you were live. And I remember you had to come in on time. You were allowed to be 1 second off. And then for every additional second you were off, as far as time was concerned, you lost a letter grade. Ooh. So if you were 2 seconds off, the best you could do was a B. You had to come right in, because he said that's the way television is. It's time specific. So, and I always liked his classes, but I double majored in English. And, that always helps with writing and all of that. And
you born here, born Pittsburgh, grew up in Bethel.
Born at Southside Hospital. My parents had already moved to Bethel Park. They were both from Hazelwood. And my dad was in the service. He was a Navy pilot, which is pretty incredible. But he was just a little too young to be in World War II. I think all during the war, he was studying to be a pilot, and we have nice pictures of him in the South Pacific and stuff, but it's after.
Okay.
And it wasn't until Ken Burns did the war and my father had passed away that I thought, I never asked Dad, where were you when the bomb was dropped?
Yeah.
Because that's, was sort of ended the war in the Pacific. It had already ended in Europe, and I thought, was Dad there? Was he en route?
Right.
And so I had all his stuff, and I went through it to see if I could find anything. And I found a program. He was playing football in Pensacola, Florida, the day the bomb was dropped.
Was he in the service at that time?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
he was in a Navy team playing.
Okay.
Pensacola is where they had a pre-flight school. He spent a lot of time at Dartmouth in Vermont, where Fred Rogers went to school for a while. And then he was down there at Pensacola pre-flight.
And your mom worked?
My mom worked all the time. She was a student at Carnegie Tech. Oh. So close. Technically, I think we right now are on campus. I think the land that QED is on campus. And my mom was a student there. I'm not sure if she did 1 or 2 years. Her family was not very well off. My mom was pretty poor. She lived below the tracks in Hazelwood. But I think it was when she passed away that I found out she was able to go to college at Carnegie Tech on a scholarship from the Buell Foundation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it just, that's so weird because they've been so good to me. The Buell Foundation has been my principal funder, and they've sent my mom to college.
That's awesome.
It is awesome. It sort of makes me ugh, which is the way I've always felt about it. And she actually dropped out to work so that my father could finish at Pitt.
Okay.
And I think she always had a bit of regret about that. She went back and she finished her school at Carlow in the early 80s. Before I came back to Pittsburgh from South Carolina, she graduated from Carlow, and that just she was so happy to have a college degree, but it was quite a bit after she started.
Were either of your parents storytellers, writers, readers? Did you get that from either of them?
That's interesting. I don't know if I've ever considered that. My mom was a great reader, and I think that was a huge influence. My mom was always reading, and it's funny, I hear all these things now about people with, upset about kids' access to books and everything. My mother always said, I don't care what you're reading, as long as you're reading.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good rule. I don't care what you're reading, And I know that I learned so much about everything just by, she didn't care about comic books. That was fine, as long as you're reading. But she was a good talker. And my dad, however, was a salesman, and I think all salesmen are good storytellers and very outgoing and all of that. So my dad, I'm sure could tell a tale, and I wish I had some recordings, but I don't.
So, as a kid, what kind of kid were you? Like, did you like school? Were you constantly reading? Did you like television, film? Any, all?
Yeah, I like those things. I was a chubby kid, and I can't say that I ever was involved in any sports. I have great memories of like sled riding and stuff like that on our street. We had a great street that was a dead end, and so it was always one of the last streets to be plowed and cindered and all of that. And we could start at the top of our hill and make a chain of sleds coming down. No, I loved school. I always loved school. And I had an older brother, Skip, and he was 2 years ahead of me in school. He was 18 months older than me. But I was always jealous of him, being a little bit ahead of me. And always that was always a driving force. I got to keep up with Skip, yes. And actually, I remember in the car. I can remember being in the car and Skip could read and I couldn't. And that was like, whoa. And I think I may have told that story, the show that I did here at QED called Things That Aren't There Anymore really came about because I was driving through the Liberty Tubes and I remembered neon signs that used to hang in the tubes that said, "Do not cross center line." Now it's funny, there's no signs hanging from the ceiling in the Liberty Tubes now, but they were there when I was a kid. And Skip could read them, and I couldn't, and he was like, I know what that says. So, but I always loved school, and I think I was always a good student. And I did my first 6 years at St. Valentine's in Bethel Park, and then sort of followed the family tradition, which Skip had started, of going to the public school for junior high. I don't know, do we still call it middle school? I'm never sure anymore, but yeah, it would be like middle school, but we called it junior high. It was 7th and 8th grade, separate building, and then on to Bethel Park Senior High, and I feel lucky about all that.
But in high school, you were an exchange student, right?
I was an exchange student. That would have been after my junior year.
Okay.
Bethel Park, this is still like incredible. I mean, at that time, I don't know if they still do it. I probably should know, but at that time, they paid for you to go to be a foreign exchange student. It wasn't a cost to my family. It was a set fee, and depending on where you went, you would have a little more spending money or something like that. And so I went in 1970. It was the summer I was a foreign exchange student to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and before that, I was the first boy, maybe ever. It was always girls that went as foreign exchange students, but I always thought that sounded so cool, and I had this urge to travel. And I also didn't speak Spanish. All the girls would go to the same city. All the girls from Bethel Park that were foreign exchange students would go to Rosario, Argentina. It was like a path that was set up, and I think they liked that. It was a tradition that girls from Bethel Park would go to Rosario, Argentina. But because I had one semester of Spanish, which I took thinking this will help me look good as a foreign exchange student, I had tons of French.
Okay.
I had, by the time I was a senior in high school, I was taking French 5 because I had, advanced placed and everything. And that was because a kid in my grade school, his mother was a French war bride, Mrs. Larkin, and she thought she would learn English better if she taught kids French. So I did that from 2nd grade through 6th grade and beyond maybe. We used to go to her house. She used to come to class, but then after, too many kids moved and changed and the class, everybody wasn't at the same level in French, she would have 6 or 8 of us at her house. And I can remember she even taught us how to make her favorite stew, which was really great. Ragout. We said R-A-G-O-U-T. That's the French spelling of ragout. It was a beef and potatoes stew, really excellent with red wine. And I remember my mother made it, and my mother said, and I put carrots in it. And I can remember Mrs. Larkin saying, no, you do not put carrots in my stew. That is Irish. And so, I got to go to Brazil, and that was because I think at Boy Scouts one night, there was a guy from Brazil, and I said, I'm thinking about applying for foreign exchange student, and he said, oh, you go to Brasilia. He said, the new capital, it's this incredible city, that's what you want to do. And so that's what I put down as my preferred destination, Brasilia. Yeah. And then I get notified that I'm going to Rio de Janeiro instead, and there was a meeting at Taylor Alderdice High School of all the kids from the Pittsburgh area who were going to go to Brazil as foreign exchange students. I'm going to guess we were 30.
Okay.
And we went there that night, and of the 30, 6 of us were going to Rio, and the other 24 were going to Sao Paulo.
Okay.
And just the way you think as a high school student, I think like, everybody's going to Sao Paulo, and I have to go to Rio. Never knowing that I hit the jackpot.
Yeah.
Everyone who was in Sao Paulo, all they really wanted to do was go to Rio, because Rio is the incredible city. I mean, Sao Paulo is good, but Rio is amazing, and and I just had a spectacular summer as a foreign exchange student. I love talking about it.
Yeah, it was the World Cup that year, right?
I arrived on a Thursday, and I think the World Cup was on Sunday, and Pelé was playing for Brazil. It was in Mexico City. And I remember I didn't know who Pelé was. And the guys in Brazil, what do you mean you don't know who Pelé is? I said, I don't know who Pelé is. And there was it was inconceivable to them that I wouldn't know who Pelé was. And yes, and so I was there. My family spoke very little English, the Vargas de Oliveras. And the father had worked for the Bank of Brazil, and he had been to America. And he spoke a little bit, but not a lot, and wasn't. They thought, hey, I was there to learn Portuguese.
Yeah.
We don't really want to talk English to you.
Did you pick it up, the Portuguese? Did you
Yeah,
pick it up?
well, you have to. Yeah. But nothing written, or very little written.
Okay.
My Brazilian mother, Dona Lelia, she would sometimes sit with me at the dining room table, and we would do, cup. What is a cup in copa? I always, there's different words, garrafa. I forget what's a bottle and what's a cup and all of that. But but I hung out with, my 2 Brazilian brothers, Edu and Kiku. Edu was my age, and we became great friends. And while I was there, I was on a program called International Fellowship out of Buffalo, New York, and there was a tragic accident. Everybody on International Fellowship who went to Peru died in a plane crash on their way to Machu Picchu. So it upset that, structure of their organization, and they were willing to consider, weird changes. And Edu said he didn't want to come to America unless he could come to my house. And so we said, can we have a direct exchange, which they didn't like to do. And they said, you can do a direct exchange if you take another one first. So we had 2 foreign exchange students come to our house in Bethel Park. Roberto Gandara Guzman from Guatemala, and then Edu came days before Christmas.
Stay in touch with them at all?
I don't. I'm not in touch with either one of them, and that's a little bit disappointing. I've looked them up on Google and stuff,
Yeah.
and nothing has come up. But yeah, no, it was a great experience and one that I loved.
And so you came back and you finished school.
I came back. I did my senior year at Bethel, and
What made you go to UNC?
I was when it was time to apply to colleges. I was reading "Look Homeward, Angel" by Thomas Wolfe, and he describes Chapel Hill in that book. He calls it Pulpit Hill, but it was pretty obvious what it was. And I just thought, like, oh, I kind of like this, and I applied to 3 schools: Harvard, Yale, and UNC at Chapel Hill.
Okay.
I was not accepted at Harvard. I was accepted on the waiting list at Yale, and Chapel Hill was like, please come here. We'll put you in the honors program, da, 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 da. And so I said, like, okay, I'm going to go to the one that really wants me. And
Yeah.
And I loved it. It was a part of the country I'd never thought I would get to, but now that I love. When I was in the Carolinas, I always said Pittsburgh was home. When I moved back to Pittsburgh, the Carolinas seemed like home because I spent 16 years there.
So you went through school at Chapel Hill. You got your internship. You also went and studied in France.
You're right. That was I spent my summer with Josie in Columbia, South Carolina at South Carolina ETV, and then I went and did a year in France.
And
So that was 73, 74, and I graduated in 75.
Lyon.
I was in Lyon. Yes, it's I say it's very much the Pittsburgh of France.
Why?
2 rivers come together. I mean, they don't make a new, it's more sort of standard. The Rhone and the Saône come together at Lyon and continue on as the Rhone. The Saône is a smaller river, but we got that, and then there's a big hill with a church on it. Just reminded me of Pittsburgh, but it's an industrial city with a great arts community and everything. So it was very Pittsburghy, and I liked it. And it's also, many people still acknowledge it's the world capital of gastronomy. You really eat well in Lyon.
Yeah.
And at that time, the most famous chef there was Paul Bocuse, and he had his famous restaurant about 20 miles north of downtown Lyon, I think. We were supposed to go there for my friend Jim Bird's 21st birthday, and he got appendicitis. And his birthday is May 21st, which I remember because it was also my mother's birthday. And he was in the hospital, so we couldn't go as we had planned to go to Paul Bocuse's. We had waited all year to do it. And he said, well, your birthday's coming up. And I said, yeah. So we went for my 21st birthday. On my 20th birthday, I started at South Carolina TV. On my 21st birthday, I went to dinner at Paul Bocuse's restaurant, and just called Bocuse. And he was on the cover of Time magazine that year, so he was a really famous chef.
And so then when you finished school, you're still working at SC?
Well, no, I had a good 6 months of job hunting.
Oh, really? But you stayed down there?
No. I came home. I remember my dad apologizing. He said, I don't know anybody in the business you want to go into, and I know that he said, I don't know how to help you. And I said, hey, I'm not expecting you to, but I spent about 6 months. Terrible, it's so different now. I mean, back then you had to type resumes, and you could have them reproduced, but everybody always suggested, oh no, make your resume specific to the job you're applying for. And I was looking at ad agencies and things like that, and then someone called me from South Carolina ETV and said, hey, we have a project that we're going to do for the federal government. We need a production assistant, and are you available? And I said yes. And so I drove back to South Carolina, and it was an energy conservation film, and it was about what you could do to make your house more efficient and all of that. It was right after the first big energy crisis, and I thought the script was terrible. So I knew people, but I was essentially alone, and I had a little apartment in Shandon, which is a neighborhood of Columbia, South Carolina, and I rewrote the script.
As a production assistant?
As a production assistant. I just thought, like, here's what I would do. I mean, on a typewriter, not on a word processor, but on a typewriter. And incredible chutzpah. Mm-hmm. I took it to the writer.
Oh.
And I guess I'm eternally grateful to her because, she didn't go who the hell are you are.
Yeah.
It was more like, oh, this is really good. She said, but you know what? My script has been approved by 6 government agencies, and we're not turning back.
Yeah.
She said, but we have an opening for a writer, and she said, this would be a really good sample to give of what you can do. And so I said, oh, okay. As a production assistant, I was working in a building across the street from where the writers were, but I applied for that job, and I got it. And so that started my 11 years at Columbia, at South Carolina ETV.
And did you start getting into making your own documentaries?
Not immediately.
Producing? Okay.
We acted somewhat as an ad agency for state government. The public television in South Carolina is a state agency, and so we did a lot of things, slideshows and public service announcements and all of that. I did a lot of that. Also, I started to write for the newspaper.
Okay.
In Columbia, South Carolina, the state. And a girl I knew in college had gone to work for Doubleday, the publisher.
Yeah.
And I don't know if she called me. Yeah, I think she called me. I mean, we didn't text at the time. She called me and she said, Rick, one of my things I have to do is put new names on our reviewers list. Would you mind if I put your name there? Because you'd always used to review books for the Daily Tar Heel newspaper in Chapel Hill. And I said, no, go do it. And she said, okay. And I started every week or 10 days, I would get a big box of books on my front porch in Columbia, South Carolina. And I loved it. It was great. I got pretty much everything I think the Doubleday was printing. And I wasn't doing anything with them. And so I thought I knew that there was a book page every Sunday in the local paper. And so I called that editor. And I said, you used to work for the Daily Tar Heel in Chapel Hill. I reviewed books and restaurants and plays and all of that. And he said, come over, I'll meet, let's meet. And I did. And he said, great, let's try it. He goes, here are the books I have. He also got books from all the publishers, not just from Doubleday. And he said, take 3, pick one to write about. And he said, if I run it, I'll give you $20 and you get to keep all the books.
Nice.
And so that started it. I became a regular reviewer. I was reviewing almost every week in the paper, usually fiction, occasionally nonfiction. But Beryl Dakers was another producer at South Carolina ETV. She did a show called Art's the Thing.
Okay.
And it was an art show. And one day she said to me, hey, you write those reviews in the paper. I really like them. Why don't you come read them on my show like Gene Shalit does on the Today Show? I said, okay, cool. So I didn't even have to rewrite it. I could just read them. And I started to do that for Beryl. I mean, and I think I'd probably done maybe 2 or 3 when the guy who had the nightly show on South Carolina ETV, which was called Carolina Journal, he said, I like those things you're doing for Beryl. Come and do them on my show. You'll have a bigger audience. And I said, okay. And so I did that. And I think I only did 1 for him. That was Tom Fowler. I just maybe 1 or 2 book reviews. And he said, you ride your bike to work every day? And I said, yeah, I do. And he said, I want you to do a story about riding your bike to work every day. He said, I'll give you a cameraman. He'll help you and you can put it together and all of this. And the next thing I know, I never did another book review. I just did little stories. I did stories about that I did the New York Times crossword puzzle every morning in the local hot dog shop. And, it blossomed from there. And I started doing all these little stories. And I remember one that I especially like about St. Patrick's Day in 5 Points, which is an area in Columbia, South Carolina, near the university. It's where Hootie and the Blowfish are from.
Okay.
And we did my friend Buck and I did a thing about St. Patrick's Day, and it was really fun. We used the Pogues music, and it was great fun, and that sort of seemed to be a turning point. And but Buck and I enjoyed working together. His name's Buck Brinson, and Buck and I enjoyed working together, and my dad got sick. And I decided I wanted to come see him. And Buck said, I want to ride with you. And I said, okay. So Buck and I drove from Columbia, South Carolina here to Pittsburgh to see my dad. And on the route, Buck said, we should do a show about the state dance of South Carolina. And I said, oh, that's kind of cool. And the state dance had just been voted on in South Carolina. It's the shag, which is kind of a slow jitterbug that people did at the beach starting around the time of World War II, but still people do the shag in South Carolina. And so when we went back, we talked to some people, and a woman there helped us raise some money through tourism and all of that. And next thing you know, we had made a film. I remember the head of production, Peter Anderson, he said, our video equipment's really busy. If you'll do this on film and keep your ratio really low, in other words, like most films and videos have a ratio of how much you shoot versus how much you use.
Okay.
And he said, if you can keep your ratio like below 10-1 or something like that, I'll let you do this on film rather than on video. And we did. And Buck and I had worked out a system. If we were doing an interview like this, he would stop the film. The audio would continue. I guess it was kind of a podcasty kind of technique. And then after we heard it, then I could say, oh, you know what, I'm going to ask you one question again. And I would just like hit Buck and say, roll.
Yeah.
Because that's the answer that I want, that one thing. So it worked out. And we had great response to that show, Shag, in South Carolina. Both Carolinas do the shag.
Okay.
But it's the official state dance of South Carolina. And then it just, from then on, and then Buck and I won a little competition at the Spoleto Arts Festival, which happens every year in Charleston, South Carolina. And we got to go to Australia for 28 days. And we covered the Spoleto Arts Festival when it went to Australia. And we were in Melbourne, and it was just excellent. And he had said, Buck's always looking for other projects. Okay, we're going to do a show about the arts festival, but let's also do a show about traveling in Australia.
Right.
And I said, okay. And so I asked for permission for that, and they said, nope, no extra days. This can't appear to be a junket. It has to just be, you're going to cover the Spoleto Arts Festival. But we realized we would have, time when you couldn't do it. And so we made that extra little documentary about traveling in Australia at the same time.
The wacky, what's it called?
Slightly Wacky Aussie Doco. Yes. And so we did a 90-minute program about the arts festival, and we did a half-hour thing called the Slightly Wacky Aussie Doco. That was, 1985, 86, and shortly thereafter, another friend who had gone on to work for the public television station, we had worked together in South Carolina. He was in Denver, Colorado, and he called me and he said, Rick, there's an ad in Broadcasting Magazine. You should answer. And I said, why? And he goes, it's in Pittsburgh. And I said, do I want to go back to Pittsburgh? And he said, you never see a big station like WQED advertising for a producer. You should answer their ad. And so I did. I was obviously riding high, having just been to Australia and everything, but I sent the Slightly Wacky Aussie Doco as a sample of my work. And WQED responded and said, why don't you come visit your parents? We'd like to meet you. And so that's how I got my job here at WQED, that thing that I made about Australia.
Did you know with when you started here at QED as a local producer, right? Did you know what the expectations were for you, or what did you think you were going to be doing? Little stories, full 30, 60 minute?
No. Well, yeah, Nancy Lavin, who's the woman who hired me here, she was the executive producer for local programming. WQED didn't do a lot of local programming then in the 80s. We were primarily a national producer. Actually, when I started here, we were still making National Geographic specials here. We already knew that they were leaving, but they were still being made here. And back where my office is now, that was a film editing unit for National Geographic. But we did a lot of science shows and really extraordinary things, Planet Earth, so we followed that up. Nancy had been hired, I think, to try and beef up local programming. And so that's what started. there were no rules. We could do sort of whatever we want. And, you know that I just recently realized that right after I came here, Mayor Caligiuri no, not the mayor. I did Mayor Caligiuri's funeral with Nancy Polinsky, but also Prince Charles came to town. Now King Charles III, and we just recently found that tape, and it's those memories of Pittsburgh seemed like the center of the universe after being in South Carolina for a while. So it was fun, and we made that show called Remaking Cities. I did a show about transplants. Mm-hmm. And that's the first show I did here. It was a half hour. So that was sort of, I think, what they expected. And I always tell the tale. I didn't know how goofy I could be. In South Carolina, I always tried to make things unexpected. And the show I made about organ transplants, because in 1987, when I came here, Pittsburgh was the world capital of organ transplants. More organ transplants were done in Pittsburgh that year than in the rest of the world combined.
Wow.
Yes, we were the world capital of organ transplants, and we did a show called Transplant Town. We used to be the Steel City, now we're the Transplant Town. And I didn't know how goofy I could be, but I had this weird thing, and I just thought, we could use organ music. So all the music in that show, Transplant Town, is organ music. Nothing is ever said about it, but I just thought, if someone recognizes it, they'll say, "Oh yeah, it's all organ music." And at the time, we used to have an all-staff screening of everything that was produced. I'm glad that's not happening right now. But at that thing, Nancy Polinsky started to laugh when she realized, oh my God, all this music is organ music, and it's a show about organ transplants. So, just a play on words and something funny that I was happy about. So,
when did the Pittsburgh History Series at QED start with your shows?
I'm going to say probably early 90s. I'd already done a couple things. I'd done Kennywood. I'd done things that aren't there anymore, I think. And we heard about L.A. in the Current, which is the PBS public television newspaper. There was an article that someone in in Los Angeles. Someone in Los Angeles was doing a series called the Los Angeles History Series. And Nancy Lavin said, you know what? There's always history in those things you make. Why don't we call them the Pittsburgh History Series? And so we did. We came up with that little logo, and we didn't limit it to 6. We just said, and we went back and put that logo, rebranded those first shows, Kennywood Memories, Transplant Town, things that aren't there anymore. We put that logo on the front of them, so they're all now considered the Pittsburgh History Series. I'm extremely proud of it. It's just amazing.
I'm not going to ask you where ideas come from, or where your ideas come from, because they come from anywhere, and there's like no shortage.
Right.
But when you do have an idea that you want to pursue, what makes you think that it could be a possible show, or it could be a topic that other people would like?
That's probably gut.
Okay.
And always the thought, can I spend 6 months on this?
Yeah.
Because that's still about how much we would spend on a show, an hour-long documentary. I remember, as an example of that, when we got to start to do national shows for PBS, I proposed that we do hot dogs and amusement parks at the same time. So we would try to find cities where there was a nice old amusement park and a great hot dog place. And always had the same crew. The crew thought no one would ever watch that hot dog show, but they loved working on the amusement park show. And both have had a nice career, or a nice reaction, but the hot dog show became far bigger than the great old amusement parks. And it was just fun, but it was always just me thinking like, I would like to watch a program on hot dogs. So that's why we did it.
But your first national documentaries were Sure Things and Ice Cream.
Right. Ice Cream and Sure Things. We got to do the national programs for PBS because of the Pennsylvania Diners show.
Okay.
It had been a big success here in Pittsburgh, and we always sent them to PBS in D.C. or Virginia or wherever they were, and they would always say, it's too local, you know, these Pittsburgh shows, too local. And then when we sent the diner show, they said, you know what? Everybody knows this kind of restaurant. Let's give this a national airing. It was probably, I'm going to guess 70 or 80 minutes long. They said, cut it down to an hour and we'll run it nationally. And we got really great ratings. That was the key. Back then, you know, it seems funny now because ratings, I don't think anybody even talks about them, but Nielsen ratings were big. And there were several cities across America where it was number one in the market for the hour that it was on. And it was also the time when people used to click through channels.
Right.
Clickers were new on your TV, and I think if you were watching and you would just click through and what's that? And it was an unusual show about diners. And so we profited from that as well. And because the diner show, Pennsylvania Diners and Other Roadside Restaurants, was so popular, PBS said, what else would you like to do? And I made a list of 10 things, on which was ice cream and shore things, or as I always say, non-environmental reasons why people like to go to the beach. We don't really talk about the ocean or the sand or anything like that. It's really just other fun stuff that you get to do at the beach. So with saltwater taffy and lifeguards and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So fishing. I remember we had a great time.
What shows have you enjoyed making the most? You know, whether it's on the road or locally, or, you know, memories with the crew.
Well, I always say, you know, I love the Pittsburgh shows probably more than the national shows, only because no one can love a national show the way Pittsburghers love a Pittsburgh show. And so, you know, I love them as a group. But I often say that, you know, the program that I think of as a turning point is hot dogs, because it was the first time, and there would have been hot dogs and in great old amusement parks, I got to pick my crew and say, I want to work with this person and this person and this person, and that made a big difference. Before that, there was often like, oh, you're going to have to go on the road with this. And when you go on the road, you are a family. It's a little bit like you're married. You're spending a lot of time together, and if you're not happy with the other people, it can be like, oh, okay, another day on the road. Yeah. But for those shows, I got to pick my crews, and I really loved that. And so, but you know, there's like the show Houses around here. I always say it's my favorite of the not famous programs. It's one of the Pittsburgh History Series, but we got to go around and look in houses, and I always think it's funny when you see a magazine about houses, there's very seldom is anyone in the pictures. It's always just the furniture and the landscape and all that. But I wanted to do a show about houses where we would meet the people that lived there. So I like that. But, you know, they are very much my children. And, you know, it's hard to say who's my favorite or all of that. But, you know, it's... the other night I was looking at something in a list. History of Pittsburgh and 17 Objects came up, and I just thought, wow, I haven't thought about that program in a while. And after about 6 months, it's as though someone else made them, and they're fun for me to watch as, oh, I forgot that we did that.
Yeah.
You know? So, and, you know, I can't think of any that make me cringe.
Okay, well, that's good. I think that's a good sign. How about your style? You know, is it called a scrapbook history style? You know, do you categorize your style, or is it just the way you tell stories? This is just how you want to do it.
That's true for a large part of it. It's just the way I think, I guess. Actually, I'm aware, because we've done so many, that each of my shows is a series of short pieces. There's not anyone that has like an overall theme. I don't think it ends up being little stories all strung together. And, you know, I didn't want to appear. I appear more in recent things and in this Gumbands podcast. But I used to I didn't want to, I love public television, and I didn't want it to look like local news television where the reporter is a major focus. Mm-hmm. I wanted to be a voice.
Yeah.
And that's the way I am in almost all of my major Maybe when we get to It's Pittsburgh and a lot of other stuff, I start to appear in some of the stories, but very little. And then in Nebby, you see me a couple of times too, I think. But I still like what I consider classic documentary style.
What show do people talk to you the most about?
Kennywood Memories.
Kennywood.
Yeah, I always think that when I die, that's what it'll say. Man who made Kennywood Memories dies. But I know that I also bolster that because when we were doing Nebby, I went back and found the old Kennywood tapes, and we did 2 more half hours, that Kennywood Summer and Don't Stand Up, which was all stuff we shot back in 1988 for Kennywood Memories that we never used, but it was good. Mm-hmm. And so that was fun to do that. And that, every now and then it's just someone will say, I grew up watching Kennywood Memories. And, yeah, and the number of people that say, I know that show by heart, it's very humbling.
And you did interview with Fred Rogers.
Right. That was right after I came here. I did a long interview with Fred Rogers.
August Wilson.
He was a Pittsburgher of the Year.
Mm-hmm.
We used to do a show every year for Pittsburgh Magazine's Pittsburgher of the Year. And that's why I got to go to New York and interview August Wilson.
And out of all the interviews you've done, do you have one that stands out of all the people you've talked to?
That's funny. Yeah. I mean, those are obviously, and I tend to not do personality journalism or whatever you want to call it. I don't have a lot of famous people in my shows. I more enjoy interviewing people that you normally aren't on television. Mm-hmm. But when people ask me that about an interview that I'm really proud of, I always like to point out that in Stuff That's Gone, the show that I did, there's an interview with Wendy King, who worked for KDKA Radio. She and her husband, Ed King, did a show called Party Line. And my grandmother and my mother were regular listeners to Party Line. It was on KDKA Radio for like 30 years. And late at night, sometimes from 9 to 11. And it was a call-in show. It was people called in, but you never heard the caller. You just heard the host, Ed and Wendy, and then they usually had a third person, who would be with them. And they would say, oh, we have a caller on the line who wants to know, where's the world's oldest roller coaster? And then people would try to respond and all this, and they would talk about anything. And I remember that show very fondly. But I knew that Ed King had passed away around 1970, I think, and I thought, I want to do something about Party Line, and I called Wendy, and she said, no, I don't want to talk about it. But then I think she had seen some of my stuff, and she goes, but I like your programs, blah, blah, blah. We talked, and we got, we established a relationship, and then I would call her every day. I'm saying, what, have you considered again? Would you do this? And then one day she called me, and she said, I've decided I would do this if you will do it in my attic. And I said, well, and she goes, that's where all the boxes are from Party Line. And it was sounded to me like so ideal. Yes, we'll go to your attic and do an interview. And so we did. And I always think very fondly of that. And she was great, obviously. And it was a voice that I remembered from my childhood. And sometimes people say that to me, oh, I grew up listening to you with Kennywood Memories and stuff. Yeah. And I think, oh, that's like Wendy King.
Yeah.
It's a voice that you know from your childhood.
So what 50 years have gone by that you've been in the business. What have you loved most about the past 50 years working in this industry?
Well, I know that I love public television and I love what it does. Public broadcasting, maybe I should say. But I think the thing that I love most is just the constant variety. Even within Gumbands, we cover a wide range of topics, and that's what I love. I love that there seem to be few limits, and I don't get stuck with a subject. And that's, I guess, partially an earlier question too. That what subjects do I want to deal with? Ones that have open ends that I can consider and talk about, and various aspects. And how does food come into this? Because I always like to figure out food seems to touch everything. Even when we did cemeteries for a national show we found a restaurant called 6 Feet Under down in Atlanta, and that was great. It was excellent, And so, the variety and the surprises. Even now, I mean, I've been working on Pittsburgh for 30 some years.
Right.
But Pittsburgh still surprises me, and I love that.
I think that variety and leaving it open-ended is what, when people consume your shows and they're watching them, it's what makes you feel part of the community too, because it covers so much. It's not, it's inclusive rather than exclusive. So I want to ask you some more fun questions, Rick. What shows do you like to watch? Do you like to watch TV?
I watch very little TV. I like to watch John Oliver on HBO. I think that's the show that I most look forward to.
Okay.
Which is kind of odd. I don't know why, but yeah. And it's weird right now because there's a writer's strike on, but
Yeah.
I do see late night comedians. I see, Jimmy Kimmel and Jimmy Fallon and, especially like Seth Meyers. And
Yeah.
He has some nice Pittsburgh connections too, which I really like. I watch 60 Minutes. I haven't been watching. I used to always watch CBS Sunday Morning, but I've been walking in the mornings, and so I don't watch it as much as I used to. But I'm not a big TV watcher, and actually more concerning to me is I realize I read less than I used to, and I think that's because we have phones that we look at, and I do Duolingo when I have 15 minutes to spare, and I sometimes play solitaire, and it's time when I think in the past I might have just been reading.
What's a perfect day for Rick Sebak? If you have the day off from QED.
Oh, a day off. Well, I start with this walk. I start every morning. It's a weird habit that I developed because I did this diabetes prevention program through UPMC.
And what's the total weight loss, if you don't mind me asking?
I don't mind you asking. It's about 150 pounds, which is like astounding to me.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't that difficult.
Okay.
And I didn't have to have surgery or anything like that. I just did it by watching what I ate and trying to increase my activity. And the activity that I've increased is walking, and I try to walk 4 miles every morning. But and so that's a thing that I get in my head, and now I have to do it. And I love the fact that I know my neighbors better than before, and people, honk their horns. And I always think I want to tell everyone, you don't know how dark your windshield is, because I think people expect me to, but it's hard to see people in cars, unless you have a convertible, and then everybody can see you.
Which you have a convertible.
I now have a convertible, so that makes you more visible. But I don't know. I do love to drive, and
Yeah.
I love this car more than any car. So I would love to go for a long drive. I still love to drive down Route 88. I did a show for Nevi called A Short History of Route 88. I find that in my past life, I used to travel a lot to find stuff to eat.
Okay.
And I'm trying to do that less. And my sister turned me on to thrift stores, and I use that, I think, as a substitute. I like to stop at a thrift store. And so I know where Goodwills are all over town, and Red, White, and Blue, and the Salvation Army, and all those things. I love to walk through a thrift store. And I don't know, sometimes people are surprised to see me there, like, oh, you're at a thrift store? I said, yeah, because, but I think I also got a little carried away with it. I've become a shirtaholic. I thought about doing a show about that, about the fact that, shirts. I just think we don't know enough about shirts.
That's a good idea.
Even just the fact that, every tag in a men's shirt says where it's made in Mauritius, made in Nicaragua, and I just think it connects us to the world in a weird kind of way. But I also know that there's terminology that I wish I knew more about. I wish I knew what you call that little button that's on your cuff. Do you know, when you...
Yeah, I have no idea.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's tailors must have a word for that little button.
Yeah.
That's there, and every piece of a shirt I just find interesting. So I say I'm a shirtaholic, but that, and I every Wednesday night I play records. That makes for a great day. And, it's that came about during the pandemic as well, when I heard that they played records at this bar in Squirrel Hill. And I said, I want to do that. And they said, we'd love to have you. And I've been doing it for, I think, I can't tell if it's 2 years now. It's over almost 3 years, maybe.
Records?
Yeah.
Oh, that's going into the pandemic.
No, it's definitely mid-pandemic, because I started it when the bar owner, Pete Kurzweig, it was his birthday, and I took him some cookies that I'd made. And he said, I got to go because I'm playing records. And I said, what do you mean you're playing records? And so, he still comes in, and he has a great memory. So last night we had 2 themes. We were playing geography, songs that have a place name in the title, and beer. And I was impressed. He thought of that Tom Waits song, Warm Beer and Cold Women. And it was perfect. That was really, I just love the fact that he just off the top of his head, oh, there's that Tom Waits song about warm beer and cold women. So, I love that. I love playing records. I don't know. I love hanging out at the house and putzing. I love sitting on my front porch. I still do. I started that during the pandemic, and I still like that.
What do you like about living in Pittsburgh?
That's a really good question. I love the variety of. I love the fact that as the 19th century became the 20th century, I think Pittsburgh was a world capital. The richest men in the world lived here. Westinghouse figures out alternating current with help from Tesla, and oil is first pumped from the ground in Titusville. I mean, we were a world center of all kinds of innovation, and I think we still profit from that. And it makes us very interesting as, I don't know, what do we call ourselves, a middle-sized city, we're a big city, but, not a giant one.
Right.
And I just like that, and I love our topography, and I love our neighborhoods, and I love the crazy people who live here. So, what more can you ask for? And I love learning more and more about it all the time.
How about favorite places to eat?
No, I won't do that.
You won't do that?
There's too many. I have favorite places to eat, and I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. But, I can tell you. You know that I love Mae Nam Thai, which is the Thai restaurant in Blawnox that's run by Supani Konsuwan. And I know her husband, Kevin Yeneral, and they've been very nice to me. I still love Amel's in Rankin, which is, an old steelworker bar that has incredibly good food. But I also love new places. I love Mitch's Barbecue. We've been to Mitch's Barbecue together up in Warrendale. And, the list goes on and on. I'm trying to think, if I got to go to, there's a new breakfast place in Regent Square that I haven't been to yet called the Famous Cafe. I look forward to that. But I also will always love the Pamela's, the P&G Diner in Millvale inside the Lincoln Pharmacy, which is, I think my go-to breakfast place. So I used to always say I loved as well Enrico Biscotti when they were serving breakfast. Now they're just lunch, I think. Since the pandemic. But I miss that breakfast. That was one of my favorite places to go for breakfast. But, I will go anywhere and try anything. I have no limits, and, I always enjoy eating.
Rick, congratulations on 50 years.
I thank you. I thank you for this opportunity to chat about all kinds of crazy things.
This Gumbands podcast is made possible by the Buell Foundation, serving southwestern Pennsylvania since 1927. And by listeners like you. Thank you.